So I know a bunch of things, but what I don't know is what you don't know. So in talking in office hours and kind of informally through the email thing, it seems like a little bit of that scatterplot discussion might be helpful, just to put a couple more connections in that you may or may not have had before, or hopefully to make things a little bit easier. So let me come in and share the screen for our old friend, this first data set. And again, to kind of start at the beginning, if we have 11 people in our study and we have scores on a predictor variable and a criterion variable, the independent variable and the dependent variable, I can use this equation over here and I can make a predicted score for everybody. So that would correspond to a dot that falls directly below or above the observed data and falls on this line. And all of these y predict values are the variable values that I'm predicting for the criterion given the scores on the predictor. And the other thing I can do is to take the dependent variable values and subtract from that my predictions and get errors of prediction. So for this observation, I predicted a 7. The data has only 6.95, so I'm off by 0.1 to 1 decimal place. Let's fix that and make it 2 decimal places really quick so everything adds up nicely. There we go. And the same way I can repeat and do that for everybody in my study. So here the actual value was higher than my prediction, so my error was 1.31. So here, so you can be a smarty pants when you get to research methods too, or other classes you might take. This variable, this error variable, is something that we also work with sometimes. We might say that this variable is the value on the criterion adjusted for the effects of the predictor. So this is a guess of what it would have on the criterion if everybody in my study had the same predictor value. This is y adjusted for the effects of f. And the other thing that we can notice about this is the y variable, my predictions, and these error terms all have a variance. So in my data set, the variance of the y variable was 3.75. My predictions have a variance of 2.5, and the variance of my errors of prediction has a variance of 1.25. And there's something fun you can notice about that, namely that the variance of the y variable is equal to the variance of my predictions plus the variance of my errors. This little equation I wrote down in here, or in words, what I just said. This little trick of saying, here's my predictions, they have a variance. Oh, and my predictions were not always accurate. Adding those up and saying those two variances together give me the variance that I observed in my data is called partitioning the variance. Partitioning the variance into predicted variation plus error variation. So are there questions about that? I'm just kind of hoping that maybe it clicks with some things you've heard somewhere else, or if it doesn't, this is something to kind of file in your head for the future. But I'm thinking that when you get to research methods too, they're believing that A, you know what a correlation is, and B, you can think about a regression line. And the point that we did in the previous work was to say that a regression line is that line that minimizes the squared distance between the observed and the predicted values. So someone asks a good question. So your prediction value is the line. Yes. When we're looking at the predictor, we could say that it's grams of caffeine, and the criterion could be amount of coffee, say. Okay, so the predictor, this is just words. The predictor variable is your X variable. If you want to say, if you want to use fancy words, you might hear someone say that that's the exogenous variable. And the Y variable, what you want to predict, is the criterion, the dependent variable. You know, I would think there might be a way. There. So now you can see I got little red dots here. These little red dots are the values, the predicted values on the line. So maybe that helps. Does that work? By all means, think about this. If this requires a little more digestion, you know, I'm available at office hours on Friday. And you know, we can kind of go from there. Or if you have some questions, by all means, chat works too. And this begins kind of the second major part where we're talking about research. And in particular, ethical guidelines. So I'm trying to make this an interesting question for you. Could we gain some information about prisoners being held in Guantanamo Bay, the worst of the worst? Would it be okay to use enhanced interrogation techniques, waterboard them to learn about an attack that might happen? Would it be okay to use these techniques on them to help our soldiers who are fighting terrorism, or perhaps inform people of military operations or attacks that might happen? We've done that too. Would it be okay to interrogate them with enhanced interrogation techniques and get some scientific information along the way that might keep our soldiers from getting sick? Where's the line there? Stop my sharing options here and share them a bit more so I can skip around the way I want to. So if we were to come in and take a look at them, these are the people, you know, they are the people who we have been holding. And some of them, for example, are involved in biological weapons programs. Some of them are possibly having information about nuclear bombs. Is it okay to torture them or enhanced interrogate them? This starts with the Tuskegee syphilis study that's mentioned in the book, but that did not hatch fully formed from American society. And the Belmont report that you have is also not something that was the starting point either for our work. This comes to us from World War II and medical ethics. Nazi medical experiments were designed to help German military personnel in combat. There were also experiments designed to help new weapons development. And they were also designed to help in the recovery of military personnel who got injured. So there was, so get out of here. So at the time, people were dying of frostbite in Russia in the war, and they wanted to know, at what point would you die? There were also experiments designed to test Nazi racial ideology. Were Germans more genetically superior and able to withstand diseases better than others? And at the end of the war, there was something called the doctor's trial. 7 people were acquitted, 6 were executed, 9 were imprisoned, and the lengths of the prison sentences were about 10 to 15 years. They said, the physicians, they said that the military necessity justified their experiments and compared their victims to collateral damage from Allied bombings. Let's take a look at some of these things. It wasn't just pure sadism. There was pure sadism involved. Before I get more into the weeds of this, we are of generally different generations, you and I. So for you folks, the Second World War is maybe something you study in history books. My father was a sergeant in the Hell on Wheels Armored Division under Patton. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was one of the first American soldiers in Berlin. He also was in the Ukraine and was really upset when they had to retreat and allow the Russians into the Ukraine. My mother was a German, and she had the experience of living on the other side of the war. Her father was imprisoned by the Nazis for giving out election information. Would you leave that phone alone? For giving out election information for the Social Democrats. You can say things about the Nazi Party, but they did do one thing right. They were corrupt. And by means of finding a relative from Austria who was in the party, who had the tattoo from early on, he got out of the concentration camp and returned home. The end of his life took another turn, but suffice it to say, don't worry that I'm talking about Nazi defense and thinking that in any way this is a good idea. So let's look at what these research topics were. Head injury experience, bone muscle nerve transplantation, freezing experience, I mentioned Russia, malaria experiments. One of the problems in Italy, for example, was malaria. Immunization experiments, they wanted to figure out if you expose people to disease, could you immunize them? They released epidemic jaundice. They were worried about poison gas attacks, so they did experiments on how toxic that was. Sulfonamide, which was an antibiotic, so they exposed people to various germs and then saw if sulfa would help. Seawater experiments, I don't understand that one, but it was whether you could drink seawater. Turns out you can't. How to sterilize people quickly. Experiments with poisons and how toxic they were. Incendiary bombs, that happened during Operation Gomorrah, when the British bombed places like Frankfurt so much that these bomb experiments became our model for how we better understand what happened in the atomic blasts of Hiroshima. So they were wondering how, what was being dropped was phosphor, and that's a very highly burning substance, and they wanted to know how could you help people recover from phosphor burns. High altitude experiments, when pilots would eject from their bomber, they would lose consciousness. So they wanted to know, there's some ways, at what point do you pass out? Electroshock, blood coagulation. These were not just sadism. Sadism was involved, but there were scientific things that they were looking at. As a result of the doctor's trial, the Nuremberg Code happened. And here's a small list of what they thought you had to do. Informed consent is essential. Research should always be based on prior animal work. You can't just start out with humans. Risks should be justified by benefits. Research should be done by qualified scientists, surprise. Physical and mental suffering must be avoided, and research in which death or disabling injury is expected should not be conducted. Not a comprehensive list, as we can see from the Belmont report, but it was a start. Interestingly, the Nuremberg Code actually comes from the Weimar Republic, which was the government in Germany before Hitler took power. So I don't think it was a victor's justice situation. This is, this was developed and this is good. You might wonder, these experiments were awful. And why were they so lenient? After all, you had 22 doctors that you were trying, and they only had 6. And it turns out that the doctors that they hanged were convicted not on the basis of their research, but because they were members of the SS. The doctors raised their legal argument that what they did wasn't anything new. And here's a quote from an article. In other words, Holland, Britain, and the US use prisoners as participants all the time without their consent. And so they were just doing what other people have been doing all along. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. If you like, there's a link to an NPR podcast about Puerto Rico. And there was a terrible hurricane in Puerto Rico. We might recall, we've had one now too. And a big public health crisis resulted. So the Rockefeller Foundation sent a bunch of doctors. One of those was Cornelius Packard Rhodes. And you can follow that link and listen to it if you're interested. He transplanted cancer into some of its patients, withheld treatment just to see what would happen, but made a letter describing what he was doing out for hospital staffs to see. And spoiler alert, he didn't pay the price. He left Puerto Rico and went on to have a very good professional career back in the US. Here's some other things. In 46 to 48, the US used prostitutes to infect prison inmates, insane asylum patients, and Guatemalan soldiers with syphilis in order to test, does penicillin really work? And then they later tried directly infecting men, and sometimes through spinal punctures. And that was about 700 people, including orphans. And this was sponsored by the Public Health Service, NIH, the Health Sanitary Bureau, which is now the World Health Organization, and the Guatemalan government. Charles Cutler led this, and he's later the guy who did the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. And he started out in Guatemala because he wouldn't have been permitted to do it in the US. And in 2010, long time, when they finally revealed this research, we apologized, and a lawsuit was generated against them. And there's a link where you can read more about that. In the 50s, we sprayed large amounts of bacteria over San Francisco, called Operation Sea Spray. Lots of people got pneumonia-like illnesses. One person died. They tried to sue. They lost. And these tests were conducted until at least 1969. 1950, Joseph Stokes infected 200 female prisoners with hepatitis. From the 50s to 72, mentally disabled children were infected with hepatitis so that we could maybe discover a vaccine. 63 to 66, Sal Krugman promised parents of mentally disabled children, their children would be enrolled in exchange for signing a consent form. But in reality, they were infecting children with hepatitis and feeding them an extract made from feces of patients who were infected already. It's a natural cure, supposedly. And at 52, Chester Southam injected live cancer cells into prisoners in Ohio State Penitentiary and cancer patients. And 300 healthy women were injected with live cancer cells without being told. And the doctors said they knew at the time it might cause cancer. The CIA LSD experiments are kind of the stuff of legend. You can read about those. We've also done etymological weapons, mosquitoes, basically to determine if we could use it as a biological weapon. In 63, 22 elderly patients were injected with cancer cells. And we also did the same to prisoners in Ohio State, just so we could watch and see how healthy bodies fight these cells. And from 63 to 69, there were various attempts to expose American military personnel to biological and chemical warfare agents. We didn't tell the soldiers this. They weren't given any protective clothing. VX, sarin, zinc, cadmium, sulfur dioxide were all things that they exposed them to. 66, the US released bacillus into the tunnels of the New York City subway system, a study of the vulnerability of subway passengers to covert attack. And we've also done that with Chicago. So these are things that were in the air that we were doing at the time that we became involved with the syphilis studies. There was medical expertise was doing research that, well, this is what I think we should do. Ethical problems don't stop with the result of our ethics. And sometimes people will propose studies that are clearly unethical. I remember one proposal in the College of Medicine where they wanted to do facial surgery. And the proposal was, we'll do the experimental surgery on one half of the person's face and not on the other. And the person didn't quite see why this is an issue. It wasn't until President Clinton's movement on this issue happened that we really had a lot of forward motion on this. It was done a little bit ham-handedly at the time. I mean, I don't think you folks were born yet, maybe, but basically they herded the faculty at Mizzou into auditoriums and said, you must sit and watch all of this training. And the people in the psychology department were kind of going, this is kind of a waste of time because psychologists have ethics already and we know what the Belmont report is and we have our ethical principles, but nonetheless, it was, a long overdue issue. The exposure of the syphilis study did not end the ethical controversies that were involved. So the Milgram study was one study that the book talks about that exposes some of the ethical issues involved. Now, the Milgram study was done for some laudable goals that, again, people could not quite understand the horrors of the Nazi regime. How could someone follow an authority figure? Should we be studying this at all? Or is this very topic so ethically compromised that we can never really do a study? It is traumatic. It was traumatic. And even though Milgram took pains to follow the people who were the participants afterward, was this an ethical thing to be doing? Some, as you read in the book, some of the people were happy that they participated, they felt they learned something. Some of the people were traumatized in ways that no one could quite anticipate. The book, and I think APA scientific consensus would be, if there is distress that's being caused, you need to stop the experiment. You don't keep going the extra mile and telling the person, oh no, you must continue, we have to keep doing this. Research with vulnerable populations poses a particular concern. Children, disabled children, are particularly vulnerable populations. This is particularly true if these children also come from other historically disadvantaged groups. It's important that their interests be looked at above and beyond the scientific motivations of the researcher. Generally speaking, when you do scientific research at Mizzou and on any campus, you're going to be doing something called CITI training. And that's a computerized human subjects and ethics training program. It takes a while, and it's not a trivial thing to go through. It's not obvious what the right answer is, but this is how we do our training here generally, so that you have a standard training that can be applied across campus. It also is going to vary a little bit depending on what populations you're working with. So I've done some work with the Palo Alto VA, and you're working with medical people, you're working with medical histories, and that involves more training and a different kind of training than if you're just going to be working with, say, intro psych standard web-based assessments. The ethical principles are available on the web. So if we were to pop out of that and come over here, you can take a look at this. You can have some pop-down things in it. And it will talk in more detail about things like beneficence and non-maleficence. Maleficence. I'll get into those terms later. And let's see where we got here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Don't you have to get like, I mean, I think this is common knowledge, but don't you have to get special training if you're working with like kids or the elderly compared to necessarily working with just like middle-aged people?
Yes. There's to summarize a little bit, there's different training if you're working with prisoners, mentally handicapped populations, children, if you're working with animals and their care. I mean, it is somewhat tailored. That's a good question. Anything else? Okay. Notice, I mean, the book doesn't talk about this, but this first section on resolving ethical issues is also in the code. And this first one is, to me, pretty important, that you need to take care that you stand up and talk about the value of truth if someone is misusing your research or misrepresenting it. One of the studies that I was involved in dealt with the effects of marijuana on the adolescent brain. And I won't get into the weeds of what all we did, but long story short, we said, if you're doing brain scans of people who have used marijuana, the reason that people might be a little bit different in terms of their brain structures might not be because they were using marijuana, but because those people who do use marijuana might have slightly different brain structures. And of course, right out of the gate, many people were happy to say, oh, this study says there's nothing bad about marijuana use. And we had to kind of step on that fairly vigorously, because once it gets out into the media, once someone says this study out of Washington University, for goodness sakes, says it's okay, you really are ethically obligated to write to the editor, to speak to journalists and say, you need to put a correction in. There's lots of conflicts between ethics and law, regulations, and other governing legal authority. So some examples here are when you are working, say, with college populations, what are the ethical issues involved in the types of data you collect? I've mentioned that I do alcohol research. I am asking people to report on an illegal activity. We also ask about the bad effects that might be associated with alcohol. Regrettable sex being one of them, drinking and driving. What happens if a lawyer contacts the researcher and says, we have someone here who was involved in a traffic accident and we think they were drunk, and as part of our prosecution, we want you to release your data on this particular subject, participant, so that we can prosecute the case. Do you release that information? If participants knew that they were exposing themselves legally, would they participate? In our case, we work with the legal counsel at the university and get something called a certificate of confidentiality, which says, to the extent possible, unless compelled by a court, we will not release this information. That's an important thing to be able to do. You wouldn't want, say, some university administrator saying, we're just going to expel everyone who says they drank alcohol because that was illegal and that conflicts with the code. It's important to anticipate those conflicts and work them out in the best interests of your research participants and the science. Sometimes there's conflicts between organizations and ethics. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the lecture today. And where you think there might be an ethical violation, your first step is to bring it to the attention of the person. An informal resolution might be appropriate, and it wouldn't violate any confidentiality rights. Now, that is a judgment call, and we'll talk a little bit later in the PowerPoint about how do we do that. Clearly, if there's an ethical violation between a clinical psychologist and a client that is a sexual of a nature, no, you don't just bring it to the attention of that individual. But if there is an ethical problem, you should first, and that's not so of such a high gravity, you should tell the person, this is an issue. And it's important to report these ethical violations and cooperate with ethics complaints and not fire complaints inappropriately. You also can't discriminate against people who do complain, or the respondent for that matter. So those are some things that don't actually usually get mentioned in the ethical code that I thought would be of interest. So let's talk a little bit more about the ethical principles specifically. Beneficence, justice, and respect for people. Beneficence means you treat people in ways that will benefit them. You should not cause suffering. And you should conduct research that will somehow benefit society. That's also an obligation of an educator. One of the things that, frankly, I regret seeing at the MU campus is sometimes professors will take a class as a personal forum for conveying power. And I often wonder, what good are you supposed to be getting out of this? Under beneficence, there's also fidelity and responsibility. You should build relationships of trust with your research participants and the other people you deal with professionally as a psychologist. And you should accept responsibility for professional behavior in research, teaching, clinical practice, and I would say other aspects of service. So that would include things like participating in the campus disciplinary board. And integrity, especially in this time of fake news and a lot of confusion as to what the facts really are. We should strive to be accurate, truthful, and honest. Sometimes people will say, well, I don't really know what's true here. And didn't you say science is a study in imprecision, or saying only what our best understanding is? Truth is an objective. It's something we shoot for, and we always strive for it. You will not at any point be able to say, I know the truth. I can, however, say, I know something that is so far along the continuum of the probable that I'm feeling really comfortable going with it. Second big topic from the Belmont report is justice. Also another APA ethical principle. Treat all groups of people fairly. Sample research participants from the same population that are going to benefit, and be aware of your biases. Now, this is, in some respects, a way that psychological research that gets conducted at the university is not meeting the justice requirement. We should be looking at the average person, say, even in Missouri, who will look quite a bit different than the people you see walking around campus. You may have biases and you may not even know of them. Just to be autobiographical, sometimes people think, oh, you're a professor, you must have grown up in a nice home and you didn't have the challenges. Well, I got news from you. Growing up, we didn't have electricity. We didn't have indoor plumbing. I remember we got electricity. It ran on the farm where it was needed. That is the barn, where it kept the cooler for the milk. And when President Kennedy got shot, my mother had my dad run the electricity from the barn to our house. And in 1966, we got a television so that I could watch the funeral of Kennedy and be able to tell my grandchildren about it. It was not, there are many biases that we have because we tend to use our own experiences and say, well, this must be what life is like for someone else. I've tried to talk about how my biases and surprise informed getting to know a little bit what life was like for children in Washington, D.C. Pretty eye-opening. I didn't even know there were ethical issues there because I wasn't even aware of any biases I had. Fifth, respect for persons. People are autonomous agents. Not only do we appreciate that people have rights, we protect their rights, even though they might not know that they have them. Particularly a concern is when people are signing consent forms. Most of the time, people are showing up for your study. They just want to get the study over with, thank you, and they're happy to sign a consent. Ethically, you have to make sure that they know what they're signing. And you need to communicate to them their confidentiality. Some people can't give autonomous consent, and sometimes people are coerced. This is a ticklish issue. So, for example, some people say, I'm going to do a really wonderful study. I'm going to go into an underserved population. I'm going to pay them handsomely, $50 to do my study, and I'll have a great study with an underrepresented population. And on top of that, these people will have some money. Is that ethical? If you offer someone a lot of money, is the lure of that money so great that they might participate in your study even when it's not in their larger interest? It's an ethical issue. In terms of learning objectives, this table is a pretty easy one for you to parse. Remember that we want you to be able to know what was in the Belmont report and how does this relate to APA principles. So these words should be on your flashcards that you're making. Deception in studies. Sometimes in order to get the data you want, we temporarily deceive people. In this particular study, as a participant, you think you're seeing a theft going on. And what they want to do is to research people's reactions. When deception happens, you are ethically bound to debrief the participant to let them know what the real story was. Ethics are kind of a difficult thing. So here's one that Karen Kitchener published a few years ago. I worked with Karen for about 20 years. And her specialty, well, she had two of them. One was reflective judgment and the other one was ethics. So let's read this through. Under pressure to succeed, a first-year student in a counseling psych grad program cheated on a final paper in a required class. The professor believes the student has potential and recognizes that exposing the student's cheating would lead to expulsion from the program and affect the student's plans to pursue a career in psychology. On the other hand, the professor is aware the student will be under pressure every day of his career, and he might be tempted to resort to unethical behavior as a result. The professor is aware that she also has a responsibility to protect the public from professionals who resort to dishonesty in times of distress. What are the obligations in this case? What do you folks do? Anyone feel comfortable sharing a few thoughts? Should you expel this person? I think first-time offenses should be treated in a lighter manner. This way, the student learns from their mistake and go on to make better choices as a professional. I think that certainly factors in. This generally is the way that we generally do resolve these things. It's kind of a nice example because it also explains why being discreet is important. So it doesn't really help the student if you say, you made this huge, terrible mistake. I'm not going to think that you should be thrown out of the program, but I'm going to run around and gossip with all the other faculty and tell them to sure have an eye out for this particular person. I mean, that could create an atmosphere that would be even crueler than expulsion. I have a few more to talk about. I see that we're at time today. Let's, as I say, put a pin in it here. And we'll take this up a little bit more on Friday.